Welcome to Onalaska United Methodist Church. I am Pastor Park Hunter, and we are thrilled to have you here for today's community conversation. You're probably aware that typically these are held down at English Lutheran, and we're always delighted to go down and visit with you guys down there, but I understand that you've moved your fellowship hall back 2,000 years in history, and so unless you like sitting on straw bales right now, this is probably a little more comfortable, and we're very happy to host today. A few things before we begin. If you need restrooms today, the women's room is just down the hallway on the left, and then past the elevator and around the corner on the left, there is a unisex handicapped restroom that men can use, or if you go out and to the right into the vestibule and downstairs, there's men's and women's rooms downstairs as well. After the program today, there are trash cans in the lobby that you can put your garbage into if you want to. If you wanted to pick up a program, those are on the green table out there in the lobby. If you need Wi-Fi today, you're welcome to it. Any of the guest networks are open, and the password is Hebrews 13v2. That's also, I think, printed on the sign above the coffee pots back there. There is another program coming up in January. We skipped December, but in January we'll be back at English Lutheran, and the subject will be corporate stewardship with Dr. Jeff Thompson. So hope you can join us for that. There are posters, again, on the green table, so if you would like to take one back to your church or place of work and hang that up, please pick that up on the way out today. Following the program, the Interfaith Leaders Coalition, which is one of the sponsors of the community conversations, will be meeting, and we're going to be meeting downstairs in the youth room. So again, find your way down the stairs, out in the vestibule, and I'll help you find your way down there. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to my friend Travis Becknell from New Hope Fellowship. He's going to offer a blessing for our meal today.
Since we serve a God that works outside of time, we'll make this retroactive to cover the meals that's been eaten before the blessing. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this opportunity and this time that we get to spend together, bringing our hearts and minds in front of you and before you, unified together. I pray that you would open our hearts this morning to receiving some experience, some instruction, some leading. Lord, I pray that it would help us to reach the people that we are desperately seeking to reach. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Amen.
Mike? I'm on. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Desmond, and I'm introducing our speaker today, John McHugh. You're in for a treat. John and I go a long way back. We were both teachers at Aquinas High School, and that's where John and I met and became very, very close friends. And I have to say, he even gave me some spiritual direction along the way, because once in a while the train kind of got off the track, maybe needed to get back on the track, and sometimes you just needed some reaffirmation that the trail you were on was a good one. And John continues to be that for me in my personal life now, as we've stayed in touch, as both of us have gone in different directions as well. I also know that he was a spiritual director for hundreds and hundreds of kids. And I was privileged enough to see him work with these kids, and the impact that he had on their lives in terms of how they treated other people was phenomenal. I've seen him speak to 400 or 500 kids where you could hear a pin drop. That's the kind of magic he had with kids who don't always listen, Dave, right? Sometimes they don't listen. And the best thing is, he taught them how to pray. And I thought that was good, because I needed their prayers and they needed the practice. Right, John? So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my good friend, John McHugh.
My father, who's now been passed away 10 years, was never an avid reader. As a matter of fact, he was the kind of individual that when we got the TV guide and there would be those 2 little articles in there that were 2 pages in length, it would take my dad a couple of weeks just to read those couple articles. Well, when I was teaching at Aquinas, I had a little log cabin north of Sparta that the class of '99 helped me build. And my dad would come down from time to time and visit me at the cabin. One day he came down to visit, and I had on the kitchen table in the cabin a copy of the Sparta Herald newspaper. It's just a weekly newspaper, small town. And my dad picked up the newspaper and he read the entire cover story. And it was one of those stories that was so lengthy it was continued on the inside. And I watched as my dad took the newspaper, he opened it up and he read the whole rest of the article. It took him about 45 minutes. I'd never seen my dad read that long before. So when he put the paper down, I said, "Dad, what was so captivating for you in the Sparta paper that you would read for 45 minutes? My dad never lived in this area. He didn't know anybody in the area. What interesting in Sparta? He said, "Well, didn't you see the front story?" I hadn't seen yet the paper. He said, "Well, there's a story about an orphanage they used to have here in Sparta." Matter of fact, I think I probably have a picture of it on the slide. And I said, "Well, Dad, why was an orphanage in Sparta so interesting to you?" He said, "Well, let me tell you why." The first 12 years of my dad's life, he lived in Southern California. My grandfather, who I never met, was an over-the-land truck driver. He'd be gone for about a month at a time. My grandmother, unfortunately, was alcoholic. And it was not uncommon for my grandmother to leave the 3 McHugh kids at home unattended. My dad was probably 6 or 7. My Aunt Carol was 5. My Uncle Jimmy was less than 2. She'd leave them unattended. She'd go down to the neighborhood tavern and she would drink all night long. Well, eventually the neighbors caught wind of what was going on and reported the situation to the authorities. So one night, Dad said, "We're at home, the 3 of us," and the police came in and took all 3 of us, put us in the back of the squad car, and they dropped us off at an orphanage. And he said that first night, Carol and I got put in the big kids' wing. And little Jimmy, because he was less than 2 years old, got put in a part of the orphanage where obviously they needed a little more attention and care. So when the lights went out that night, I walked out of bed and I finally found Carol. I said, "Hey, grab my hand. We have to go find little Jimmy. He's someplace in this orphanage." So they wandered the halls of this huge complex in Southern California and finally found the little kids' wing and went from crib to crib looking for little Jimmy. And when they finally found him, he was in the crib so terrified he couldn't even scream or cry. His eyes were wide open. And so Dad said, "Carol, here, grab my hand." And they grabbed each other's hands and they crawled into the crib and they slept with Jimmy that night to keep away the tears and the fears. Well, the next morning, as the people who ran the orphanage were doing the rounds, they found all 3 McHugh kids in the same crib. And get this, they punished my dad. They said, "When the lights go out at night, you can't leave your room. You can't leave the wing. And if you're going to sleep in a crib like a little baby, we're going to treat you like a little baby." And they took a crib and they moved it into the big kids' wing and made my dad sleep in that for the rest of their time in the orphanage. Well, at the end of the month, my grandfather came home, found out that his kids were in an orphanage, was able to get all 3 kids out. And when my dad was done telling me the story, there was just tears streaming down my cheeks. Now, my dad was a prolific storyteller. That's probably where I get it from. He'd start telling a story and go, "Yeah, I heard this one 77 times. I know this one. This is story number 102, you know." And out of all the stories my dad had ever told me, he never told me that he had spent time in an orphanage. I said, "Dad, that's a very touching story. That's very moving. How come you never told me that before?" And my dad said this to me. He said, "Johnny, you never gave the sense that you wanted to hear a story like that from me before." And I realized that I had failed in my listening skills, is that I had not given to my own father the means to say, "You know what, I want to listen. I want to hear your story. I want to hear everything that makes you tick," is I'd failed to listen. And when I walked away from that experience that week, I realized that for me, as a business leader, the most important thing I do is listening. Now, let me backtrack. For those of us in corporate America, especially those in retail, we talk about listening to the voice of the consumer, listening to the voice of the customer. We have to listen to our board of directors. We have to listen to the CEO. We have to listen to our boss. But for me, it starts before that. It starts early in the morning. That after I get up, get dressed, the first thing I do is I sit down in my prayer chair and I spend time in prayer. Because if I don't listen to God, first of all, the rest of it is out of whack. And I sit down in prayer, and every morning I ask the same question. God, what do you need me to do today? What do you need me to do today? And how I ask that question is every week I pray through the gospel that we use in liturgy on the upcoming Sunday. I have the app on my phone. So I open it up every morning and I read through that. So in the scriptures, what is it that you're telling me that I need to do today at work? That's my first listening. That if that listening doesn't happen, the rest of it is out of whack. Next slide. In business, I also believe that for those of us who are business leaders or leaders of any sort, if we learn how to listen, we also then have this wonderful ability, because we've started the day in prayer, to listen for pain in others. And that pain can be redemptive. Let me explain. As Mike knows, the first 2 years of my life, so did Dirchie's first 2 years of my life, I actually taught a grade school at Cathedral. Now, I think it was an unmitigated disaster, okay? Some people might say otherwise. And so that first semester when I was teaching, I actually went back home to my hometown of Hatley, Wisconsin, near Wausau. And I wanted to watch the pro in action. My fourth grade teacher, Mildred. Mildred was shaped like a giant pear. Now, and I don't mean this as a derogatory expression, please, because this is going to be real significant in her own words for the story. Because when Mildred was teaching you, if she took one look at you and she could tell that something wasn't quite right with you that day, she would just keep teaching, their textbook in her hand, and she'd walk up to you, and she'd give you this big hug where you were seated, and he would just kind of disappear inside of her someplace, you know? You just knew that she cared. So there was a day in which we didn't have school here in La Crosse. I drove up to Hatley. Hopefully I could pick her brain at recess. And I was just about to walk into her classroom, and she was in there with one of her fourth grade students. And this little fourth grade girl was poking Mildred in the chest with a great deal of anger. And she said, and I wrote all those things on the blackboard because that's what I think of you. And I poked my head in, and there on the blackboard was every bad word you could imagine. And Mildred was so calm and so collected. And the bell rang. All the kids filed in from recess. And I plopped myself in the back of the classroom, the last seat, and I just observed for the next 3 hours. And 3 times during the course of the afternoon, Mildred just walked up to where this little girl was seated and just gave her a big hug. 3 times. 3 o'clock, the bell rings, and all the kids are filing out of the classroom. This little girl walks past Mildred and just gives her a big hug around the waist and says, I love you. Now, 3 hours earlier, you saw what she was writing on the blackboard. And so Mildred and I went to the teacher's lounge. I said, Mildred, I came to watch you in action, and what I saw was a perfect example. How is it that as a teacher, you were able to take one look at us and know that we needed one of those hugs from you? She said, Johnny, 2 things. First of all, in the morning, I pray for all of you as students. I pray for you by name, and then I ask God, give me the strength and the ability to reach out to them if they need me. So I opened myself up in that prayer. Secondly, she said, I'm able to recognize it in your eyes because I'm blessed. I'm blessed. You know, and I've heard people say this, especially in a religious context, I'm blessed. Yeah, but what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Concretely, what does it mean I'm blessed? She said, well, I was blessed with pain in my life. Mildred, how is that a blessing? She said, well, I was blessed with pain in my life. And because I had it in my life, I recognize it in others. And this was the story she told. She said, Johnny, I'm 64 years old. I'm about to retire. I'm shaped like a giant pear. I start small, I get bigger as I go down. If you're about to retire from teaching, it's not a bad physique. The problem is I was shaped like this when I was in 7th grade. And when you're in 7th grade and you're shaped like this, it's a death sentence. She said, I sat in the front seat of the school bus every day by myself. Nobody would sit with me. My classmates would walk past me every day and say, no one can sit with you, you're too big. They said that every day. One day somebody sat with me. And not just somebody, but the most attractive boy in the 7th grade class. And he sat down next to me, and I got all nervous inside and giddy, and my palms started sweating. I didn't know what to do. And finally, halfway home, he leaned over. He said, I suppose you're wondering why I'm sitting with you. It's like, yeah. Well, at recess, I lost a bet. The punishment's I'd have to sit with you on the way home. She said I couldn't wait for the bus to stop in front of my house. When the bus stopped in front of my house, I ran into the house, ran into my bedroom. I cried myself to sleep at 3:30 in the afternoon. And she said, when I got up from that nap, I remember looking in the mirror and seeing my eyes all bloodshot and red from the tears. And she said, I could have chosen to forget the memory. She said, I've chosen to remember it. Because then when I'm teaching and I look out at my kids and I look into their eyes and go, oh, I recognize that look. Johnny, what would I do? Now, you'd walk up to us, you'd give us a big hug, and we would just disappear inside of you someplace. She said that was ministry for me. But I wasn't able to do it unless at the beginning of the day I hadn't opened myself up to God and said, God, give me the courage and the generosity and the love to reach out to them and to see it if they need it. Is that when we start our day listening to God and say, hey, put me in places where I need to be, help me to do what I need to do today, that's when you start to see the things that maybe you didn't see before. And we believe, and I actually train this at Kwik Trip, we train this actual story. And this example is that when you walk into the store in the morning and you see one of your coworkers, that, you only have 30 of them, and you can tell that something not right with them that day, you tell them, I don't know what it is. I can't solve it. I can't fix it. I may not even know what it is, but I just want you to know that I care. It takes you all of 30 seconds. But for us, that's what makes a great place to work. For those of you who study corporate culture, there's something called the Gallup 12, the 12 questions that make a great place to work. And one of the critical statements in that is this. If my supervisor cares about me as a person, you'll say it's a great place to work. Just care and compassion if we open ourselves up at the beginning with listening. Next one. Listening for the dignity in others. As believers, we all believe that every human person has human dignity. But sometimes we forget that. We start to see their issues, and we start to see more the issue than the person, and that the person has dignity. My dad taught me that in a real profound way, that when we see people who have experiences or needs, we can minister to them or with them, but sometimes we do it in a way that doesn't protect their dignity. We could do it in a way that does protect their dignity. The next part of the story of my dad is that at the age of 12, my grandmother left my grandfather, and they moved to northern Michigan. At this stage of the game, they had now 6 kids by the time they eventually moved. And my dad was the oldest. And my mom enrolled all 6 kids at St. Ambrose Catholic School in Ironwood, Michigan. And the first week, my grandmother gave Dad $3 for lunch money. It was 50 cents a student. They had 6 kids. So Grandma gave Dad the $3 because it was the responsibility of the oldest child in the family to buy all the lunch tickets. So that first week, my dad paid for his lunch tickets, gave the other 5 to his siblings. My dad knew that the next week, they wouldn't have $3 for the next week. And so, feeling that he was the man of the family, because there was no dad, feeling responsible, my dad watched where Sister Vidalia kept the lunch money in a little box. And so on Friday, that first week, when she went outside as the kids were leaving, my dad went to the lunchbox and he grabbed out $3. And he was just about to put the lunchbox back when Sister Vidalia came in the classroom. Caught him. And my dad initially panicked. Geez, here it says first week in a Catholic school and it's a nun, man, and I'm stealing and that's a commandment. This ain't going to go well. And Sister took the time to realize what was going on in his life and what was going on in the family. So this is what she did. She gave him the $3 and said, now every Monday when you come up for your lunch tickets, I'm going to give you an envelope. And inside the envelope is going to be the lunch tickets for you and your siblings. And also will also be $3 for the next week. And we'll just keep rotating that all year long. So my father, the week before he died, I was going through his checkbook. We were going through bills that he always wanted me to continue paying. And one of them is that every Valentine's Day, he would send flowers to Sister Vidalia, who is now retired. And I said, Dad, why do you do it? Because she protected my dignity. She could have made me come to the front and grovel for the money or in front of my classmates and say, Sister, I don't have money. And she did it in a way that nobody ever knew. Protected his dignity in ministry. Some of you might recognize the other person up there, Mike Sherman, head coach for the Green Bay Packers for 6 years. Now, they say as a coach, he was not the most effective, especially after he left the Packers. But all the players that have ever played for Mike Sherman said as an individual, he was extremely faith-filled and he lived it. And here's a perfect example. It was in November, on a Sunday morning, and they were up in Minneapolis. The Packers were going to play the Vikings. And Sherman went for an early morning walk, walking down downtown Minneapolis. That time the Packers were 6-1. He was kind of reveling in the fact they were successful. And as he was walking downtown Minneapolis early that morning, he saw an individual who was homeless sleeping on the side of one of the heating vents. And so Sherman reached into his wallet and he grabbed a $20 bill and gave it to the individual. But then he kept on walking and he realized, went back to the individual and said, hey, would you like to have a hot breakfast? Sure. Well, I'm staying in the hotel down the way. Why don't you come to my hotel room? I'll let you order room service. So Mike Sherman brings the individual to his room, gets the menu and said, hey, whatever you have, it's on me. And as they're waiting for the meal to show up, he said, well, I suppose it's been a while since you've had a hot shower. Yeah. Well, there's a separate set of towels in the room. Why don't you go take a shower while waiting for breakfast? So he showers and he comes back and they're having breakfast, and Mike Sherman said to him, hey, have you ever been to a professional football game? Now, this individual doesn't know who Mike Sherman is. And the guy says, well, I've never been to a professional football game. Sherman says, well, I can get you to the game today. The only catch is I can't get you a ticket to the stadium. You're going to have to be on the sidelines, but you're going to have to be in the sidelines of the Green Bay Packers. Would that be okay? The guy's like, sure. He said, well, I got to leave for the stadium. I'm going to send a driver to pick you up in 2 hours, about 45 minutes before the game. They'll have the pass for you. So the individual's on the sidelines during the game, and Bob Lamonti, who is Mike Sherman's really the person who does his personal contracts, his negotiator, recognizes that there's some individual on the sidelines that he had never seen before. So Bob Lamonti, in the middle of the game, says to Mike Sherman, hey, who's this guy? And Mike Sherman said, well, it's this homeless guy that I met this morning. I invited him to my hotel room. I bought him breakfast. I let him use the shower, and I invited him to the game. And Bob Lamonti says what probably many people would say, are you crazy? You don't know this guy. You don't know what kind of issues he has psychologically. You don't know if this guy is dangerous. Aren't you afraid of this guy? And Mike Sherman said this, I'm not afraid of this guy. I'm more afraid of myself if I saw him on the street homeless and I did nothing about it. That's why he's here. I'm not afraid of this guy. I'm more afraid of myself if I saw someone like that and didn't do anything about it. Dignity. He could have just given him the $20. Frankly, I'm not so sure I'd have the courage that Mike Sherman did to do what he did. But he lives it, protecting the dignity of others. That listening, again, you could substitute the word prayer in here for so many of these things. That prayer comes before something that all of us in corporate America have to do from time to time for those of us who supervise people. Sometimes you have to confront poor performance. You probably can't see that, I apologize, but it's an old Calvin and Hobbes, and he's on a booth that says, a swift kick in the butt, $1. Okay? How's business? Terrible. Well, that's hard to believe. I can't understand it. Everybody needs what I'm selling. Unfortunately, sometimes in business world, in corporate America, as leaders, that's our approach to confronting poor performance. You know what? At some point in time, you just got to give them a little kick in the rear end. You've heard that. Some of you may be victims of that. Maybe you've even done it yourself. Internally for me, I will say that when I have to confront poor performance with someone in my staff, I spend more time in prayer that morning than I do my other mornings. And here's the reason why. I believe that most people on this planet want to do a good job. They do. I don't know of too many people on this planet who say, you know what, I got a job, I'm going to go this morning and I'm going to be the most ineffective, pain in the butt, problematic coworker that I can possibly be. That most people want to do a good job, but what happens is sometimes they fail. And here's the image I can think of. This is going to sound bad. It's rather embarrassing. I was probably about 10 years old, and I still had training wheels on my bike. Okay? For those of you who are parents, you remember your kids, the training wheels came off long before that. My dad, who worked construction, a rather colorful character in a lot of ways, one night he came home from work that spring and he saw his 10-year-old son riding with all the other neighbor boys, and all the other boys had no training wheels on. Johnny still did. For my dad, that's embarrassing. So that night at dinner, Dad said, tonight, Johnny, the wheels are coming off. You're going to ride a bike like a real man. And I was terrified because I'd never ridden a bike without training wheels before. And I'm like, yeah, Dad, that's fine, provided one condition. I want to wear my Evel Knievel helmet. I had an Evel Knievel plastic helmet because I knew I was going to crash. You're not wearing a helmet. The training wheels are coming off. You're going to learn tonight after dinner. So after dinner, Dad went to the garage to get the pliers to take the training wheels off. He plopped me on that bike, and he gave me that first fateful push. And remember when you're learning how to ride a bike without the training wheels, it was fine if you kept going straight, but if you had to turn a little bit, that's when you lost your balance. And when my dad gave me the push, he pushed me towards the only obstacle we had in our backyard, an old oak stump. And as fate would have it, man, right towards that stump I went. And I hit it dead on. And because the other reason, remember you panicked, you forgot to brake, you pedaled backwards, but in your panic you forgot to do that. Head on, over the bike handle I went and hit my head on the edge of the stump, and I remember looking up and feeling that salty taste of blood. And I looked up, and I saw something I saw only once in my entire lifetime. It was my dad in his construction boots, his jeans, his flannel shirt, and he was running. It's the only time I ever saw my dad run. He was running to pick me up. His son had fallen, and he was running to pick him up. And when I have to confront poor performance at work, that's the image I pray through in the morning. Is that, you know what, I've asked one of my coworkers to do something that's challenging for them, that's new to them. I'm asking them to take some training wheels off. And you know what, they want to be able to do it, but they're terrified. And sometimes when I ask them to do that, sometimes they fall, or they're falling. And it's my responsibility as a Christian leader to go and help and pick them up and say, what is it that I can help you with? What do you need? And so if you ask anybody in my crew, they'll say, what happens if you have to go meet with John? Here's the first question I tell them. First statement is, I know you want to do a good job. What can I do to help you to get better? How can I help this? And sometimes, the failure has nothing to do with workplace performance. It has something to do with going on at home. And so, you know what? Let's just take 45 minutes. I'll just sit. Let's just listen. And let's just talk about it. And you know what? I don't mean it to brag. But if you ask anybody on the staff, they'll say, you know what? If you get called into John's office to confront poor performance, you get a free counseling session as well. He cares. That for me, in corporate America, when we have to confront that listening, God, what do they need? What's going on in their life? Why are they failing or why are they falling? And then give me the courage and the generosity to go and help pick them up. Listening, praying, comes ever before confronting. Next one. Listening for the right way to do business. We also believe that there's a right way and a wrong way. And some of you heard me talk about ethics may remember this story. It's an important one. We use it actually in training as well. This whole thing about the bike? Well, my parents purchased that bike for me when we lived in South Milwaukee. And then it was sometime after the training wheels came off that we actually moved to this little town near Wausau, a town called Hatley. And most of the roads that we had in Hatley at the time were gravel roads. Well, all my new friends that I found had these wonderful 20-inch bikes that had the knobby BMX tires on them. My bike was meant for the sidewalks of South Milwaukee. It had smooth tires. And so I couldn't keep up with the guys that had the BMX tires, the knobby tires. So finally one night I said to Dad, can I get new tires on my bike? Are they flat? No, they're not flat, but they're not knobby. I can't keep up with the guys who have the knobby tires. Mine are slick. They're not flat? No. We're not getting new tires then. Pedal faster, Well, one night I was driving into town in the spot where the gravel road ends and the blacktop begins when you got into the city limits. There was a cable across the road. It was attached to a little black box in the ditch. It had not been there the day before. So when I got home later, I said to Dad, hey, Dad, you know where the gravel road ends and the blacktop begins? There's this cable across the road. What's that for? He said, well, is there a little black box attached to it in the ditch? Yeah. He said, well, it's a meter. It's a sensor that the Department of Transportation puts there. And every time the car goes across the cable, the weight of the car registers a click in the box. And at the end of the month, they're going to pick up the box, and they're going to figure out how many clicks there are. And if there's a lot of clicks, it means we have a lot of traffic on our road, and they're going to upgrade our road from a gravel road to a black. You know where the story's going, don't you? And so as soon as I realized this, I beelined it back to the spot, and I started jumping on this cable, Well, as a 58-pound weakling, that was not enough to send a click in the box, But I remembered my physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. My dad worked construction, so I went to his garage and I got his 10-pound sledgehammer. Thinking if I can hit this cable dead center with the sledgehammer, that's going to be enough force to register a click in the box. So I went to this spot in the road and I started whacking at this cable. And when I was lucky enough to hit it dead center, in the box you heard this mechanical click. Like, sweet. So I'm whacking at it. And unfortunately, much to my demise, there's a house right there, and it's owned by John Zajikowski. John Zajikowski is a retired police officer from Wausau, okay? Still lives there. And he looks out his front window, he sees little Johnny McHugh in the middle of the road with a sledgehammer, so he opened up the front door, he said, "Johnny, what are you doing?" I said, "Hey, I'm getting us a blacktop road. Get home right now." So I walked home, walked into the grass with the sledgehammer, and there's my mom and dad waiting for me, busted. Mr. Zajikowski had to call Mr. and Mrs. McHugh and tell them what Johnny was up to. And this is what my parents did for me for a punishment. And this is what they did every time I pulled a stunt like this that was not ethical. Because my mom and dad believed that I was good at heart. And Johnny, if you would just think about what you do, you wouldn't do it. Was that the right way to get a blacktop road? So this was the punishment. Every night for the next month, after chores were done, I had to go into my room and I had to sit in my red beanbag chair. Remember when we had red vinyl beanbag chairs? And I had to listen to a record, an album, a 33, of the Letterman singing inspirational songs. I still remember the whole album. Old Man River, that old man. I remember the whole album. Every night for a month. Because my mom said, you're going to sit in that room and you're going to listen to words of inspiration. Because if you would just listen to those words, you realize that there was a right way and a wrong way. That's when they taught me listening and contemplation and prayer. Lord, what do I need to do today? But how do I do it in a way that's right so that I don't do it in a way that's wrong? Listening is part of ethics. Listening for an opportunity to express gratitude. Again, for a high workplace performance, they'll say that if you want high performers in your workplace environment in corporate America, this is what you need to do. You need to thank your people, express gratitude. Matter of fact, studies have shown not just express gratitude, you have to do it every 7 days. Now, you can express gratitude occasionally, but you're not going to have a high-performing work culture. If you want a high-performing work culture, you do it every 7 days. Once a week, you thank your people. Well, sometimes I forget that, but when we express gratitude, two things happen. It motivates our coworkers, certainly, but I also think it does something for the person expressing gratitude. And studies have shown, for those of you who have done any work in happiness studies or in deep joy, is that your joy and your happiness is also proportional to how grateful you are. That if every morning you sit down in prayer and you just go through the list of all the things that you're grateful for in life, your happiness, the psychological stuff inside your head, it goes up substantially. And I think about that in a profound way in which Jesus, my real boss, when I gather for liturgy on the weekends, and there's this wonderful line in what we call the Eucharistic prayer. And on the night in which he was betrayed, the night he was betrayed, he took bread and gave thanks. On that night of all nights, he was able to give thanks. Boy, if he on that night was able to express gratitude, how does that challenge me in my prayer to look at the things in my life that maybe instinctively I'm not grateful for or I don't think are gifts, but really, from a God perspective, are gifts? That sometimes the gifts that have been given to us don't come in the way in which we want them wrapped, but they're still gifts. I'll give you a perfect example. My grandmother's now passed away. She always wanted to go on a cruise. My grandfather would never go on a cruise for two reasons. They had a farm in Phillips, Wisconsin. Grandpa was so loyal to the farm, he'd never leave it, for more than a day. Secondly, Grandpa hated water, so there's no way you're going to get Grandpa on a big ship in the middle of the ocean, Well, after Grandpa died, my grandmother saved up her pennies, her nickels, and her dimes. Again, she was a retired farmer, and saved up enough money to go on a cruise. So she contacted my mom and all of my aunts and said, would one of you like to go on a cruise with me? And they all said no. And the reason why they said no is Grandma was rather high maintenance, okay? And being on a ship for 3 days with Grandma was nobody's idea of a vacation. Well, I was actually at Cathedral at the time. I just finished grad school, and so I was 26 years old, and Grandma called me and said, Johnny, would you like to go on a cruise with me? Like, Grandma, I'd love to go on a cruise, but I can't afford that. No, I saved up my pennies, my nickels, and my dimes. If you go with me, I'll pay your way. Okay, Grandma, I'll go. Now, the first indication that this was going to be high maintenance time was when we got down to Miami to board the ship. And I said, Grandma, get your passport out. They're going to have to check your passport. And Grandma goes, Grandma, maybe it's the passport in your luggage. So she opens up her suitcase and goes through everything, and I end up seeing more of my grandmother's underwear than I really cared to see, you know. And the line's getting closer and closer, and finally we get to right before we're going to be last people, and I'm thinking, we ain't getting on this ship, you know. And Grandma reaches into her suit coat pocket and goes, oh, here it is, as if nothing's happened the last half hour. Now I've already lost 30 pounds of sweat, you know. So we get through passport control, and we're on the opposite side of the dock getting ready to board the ship, and now I'm a little bit more relaxed and calm, and I'm looking around, and I notice that everybody else that's about to get on the ship, they're young, they're couples, and they're very loving toward each other. Now at this stage of the game, I was 26 years old, and my grandmother's 80. And finally this guy looks at me from about where Mike is to me, and looks at me and my grandmother and says, loud enough for me to hear, isn't it wonderful that love knows no age boundaries? I'm on a honeymoon cruise with my grandmother. So I said, Grandma, did you research this thing before you booked it? I think we're on a honeymoon cruise. She said, no, I just called the travel agency. These are the dates. Get me on that boat. So the next 3 days, as Grandma and I are like laying out on the deck, people are walking past me, and they're looking at my grandma, and the guys are going, dude. Thinking that when she dies, I got to be in it for the millions, you know, kind of thing. So finally, the last night, you know how you always eat together in the ship? I said to the head waiter, hey, can I make an announcement, please? Sure. I said, hey, folks, I know this is a honeymoon cruise, but truth be told, this is my grandmother, and I'm the grandson. It's an accident that we ended up on this ship. And they busted, got laughing. Well, I got back home. I went back to work. And, you know, when you get back from vacation, sometimes you just get caught up on all the things that you missed. And about a week later, my mom called me and said, hey, Johnny, I just got off the phone with Grandma. She was rather quiet about the whole cruise thing. Like, that's because you don't talk about what happens on a honeymoon cruise when you get back home. You know? She's like, no, it's not that all. Did you remember to send Grandma a thank you note when you got home? I'd completely forgotten. You know how you get back after vacation, you get caught up in your daily routine of getting completely forgot to send her a thank you note. And I realized that, you know, ideally I would love to go on a honeymoon cruise. But I'd love to go on a honeymoon cruise with the lovely and talented McHugh, my wife, not my 80-year-old grandmother. But even though it wasn't the gift the way I wanted a gift, and it came wrapped differently than maybe the way I wanted to, it doesn't diminish the fact that it was still a gift. Matter of fact, not just to me, but to my grandmother. And Maggie was fortunate enough to be with my grandmother when she was dying. And Grandma said last couple hours, one of her favorite experiences the last 10 years was the cruise with Johnny, you know. Sometimes we've been given gifts from God, but they don't always look like a gift. Unless we take that time in the morning to step back and say, Lord, what do you need me to do today? Give me the opportunity to do what I need to do. And one of the things that you're going to put in my life, or you have put in my life, that maybe I don't see as gift, but really, if I realize that they are gift. And then when that gratitude spills over, your joy increases, your love increases, and then you're able to express that gratitude to the people that work with you and around you. Hey, thanks for doing the work you do. Thanks for making a difference in this place. Thanks for treating others with compassion. You instinctively become a person of gratitude in prayer. Final story. Listening to what really matters. The crew at Kwik knows this, is sometimes in our senior management team, I'll remind them that, you know, we have a huge debate. Should we be selling quarter-pound hot dogs on the roller grill or third-pound hot dogs on the roller grill? And there becomes sometimes, and I use this just as an example, sometimes we get this huge debate, and people like dig their heels in, well, it should be quarter-pound dogs, it shouldn't be third-pound dogs. And I'll say, hey, time out. When all was said and done, and we're up there, okay, is it going to really matter what size the hot dogs were on the roller gizmo? It ain't going to matter. So let's put it in perspective. Let's not ruin relationships or friendships that we have senior managers have had for 15, 20 years because of the size of the hot dog. But you know, sometimes in business we get so wrapped up in those little things and we think that they really matter. Is that what we believe as Christians is that this isn't it, folks. There's also another place. And when you keep that eternal perspective, that forces you to think differently about this perspective. And so the second nuance I do in that prayer is, Lord, not only what do you need me to do today, but the second question I ask in prayer is this: what do you need me to do today that matters for all of eternity? What do you need me to do today that matters for all of eternity? And here's where I learned it. Whether that was at Cathedral or at Aquinas, at one point in time, the kids would always ask me this question. Hey, you've dedicated your life to the Lord, and you believe in the gospel, and you've made life changes because of this. What happens if when you die, there's nothing? Boy, then you really lost it, didn't you? You lost the bet. Every year, some kid would always ask that question. And every year I had the same response. Two things. So first of all, I would cite a French philosopher by the name of Pascal, and something called Pascal's wager. Some of you might be familiar with that. And Pascal said, if you're going to bet on the fact that there is an afterlife. Because if you bet on that and there is an afterlife, you won the lottery. If you bet that there isn't an afterlife and then there is, talk about losing the lottery. That's Pascal's wager. So I said, trust me, folks, it's worth the bet. Secondly, and this is what I'd always say, even if we get to the other side and there is no other side, but I've lived my life according to gospel values on this side, it still brought me joy and happiness. It's not like my life has been diminished or made less because I lived the gospel. It's actually brought fulfillment even on this side of life. So no matter what happens, I don't lose. Well, one of the very first times I was asked this question was when I was in Rome. I was doing graduate studies there for 4 years. And the first year I was in Rome, I actually worked in a parish school called San Giuseppe al Trionfale, the other side of St. Peter's. I helped teach fourth grade students. And the Italian boys have a nickname for each other, Massimo. It literally means the big one, the maximum one, Massimo. So if you're walking down the streets of Rome, if you've ever been there, you hear guys like, hey, yo, Massimo, hey, Massimo, big one. Well, we had this little fourth grade guy in our class that everybody called Mini-Mo, because he was so tiny little kid, Well, Mini-Mo just gravitated towards me. I mean, at recess, he'd literally be hanging on my legs or just hanging around me. Well, one day in class, one of the kids asked me that famous question. John, what happens if when we die there's nothing? And you've gambled on it that there is. Boy, aren't you going to be the big loser? So I explained Pascal's wager. And then I said, again, if there's nothing on the other side of life, it still brought me joy on this side of life. So even if there's nothing, I'm fine with that. And as I was doing that long explanation, Mini-Mo was back at his desk. And they had, those desks where you'd open up the top and you could keep your books inside. And Mini-Mo keeps opening up the desk and shutting it. And opening it up and shutting it. Clearly, he was distracted. Well, at recess time, the bell rang and the kids are walking out of a classroom, and Mini-Mo walks past me, looks right at me, and says, I don't like you anymore. He walked out. And at recess, he just avoided me. In the afternoon, now you could tell that he was just upset with me. So when the kids left for the day, I went to the primary teacher. I said, hey, what was up with Mini-Mo today? Talking about copying an attitude with me. I mean, what was going on with him? And the teacher said, John, in religion class today, you offended him deeply. Why? When you said that you're okay if there's no afterlife, maybe you are, he's not. Let me show you. And as he's walking me back to Mini-Mo's desk, he explained that Mini-Mo was an only child. His mom and dad, 2 years prior, were on vacation on the Amalfi Coast, south of Rome, curvy road. Came across one of the curves, and a driver hit him head on, killed both of them. And he said, let me show you what Mini-Mo was doing when you were saying there might not be an afterlife. And he lifted up the inside of Mini-Mo's desk, and there were all the pictures of Mini-Mo and his mom and dad. Because maybe I don't need an afterlife, but that kid does. He needs the promise that there's a resurrection. He needs the promise that the stories that we formed on this side of life do not end with death. He needs to know the promise that he will see his mom and dad again. That this isn't it, folks. That if this is it, it's a valley of tears. That we need the promise of an afterlife. And Mini-Mo taught me that when you come from that perspective, it also brings you joy. When you realize that, there's some things in this side of life we're never going to be able to fix. Some things on this side of life we're never going to be able to redeem or change. But we who believe in a God who can, does, and will change it all and redeem it all, that's what brings us joy. And that's where we can come from the perspective and realize, at the end of the day, the size of the hot dog on the roller grill doesn't matter. And that puts it all in perspective for us who believe. Then when we start our day in prayer and we ask God, what do you need me to do today? What do you need me to do today that matters for all of eternity? What do you need me to do to recognize pain in someone else? What do you need me to do to help someone who's fallen and pick them up? And what do you need me to do today so I recognize that you've gifted me and others and I can express that gratitude? When that all happens, faith in business makes a perspective difference. It brings joy and it brings happiness, and I think it brings better places to work. Thanks for your time and attention. It was good to be with you this afternoon.
John, thank you very, very much. I've been preaching a lot of years, and I'm sure I wish I would have sometimes said what you just said. I mean, it was a powerful, powerful message. I'm serious. Thank you. So, but comments for anybody? Anybody want to ask a question for John?
Yeah, excellent question. Tim's like, how do you deal with the fact that there sometimes can be a pushback to Christianity? Well, I'll tell you how we do it internally at Kwik Trip. I'm actually on the speaking circuit pretty extensively on behalf of our company, and I was telling the crew earlier, the biggest request I get now for a keynote is how do you incorporate faith into business? Now, it's unsolicited. We don't publicize the fact that I do keynote addresses, just word of mouth. Somebody hears me and said, can you come here? There's a couple things that we do that are a little more nuanced. Our mission statement at Kwik Trip is to treat others as you would like to be treated. Now, those of you who know the scriptures well know that that's the golden rule. Well, here's the neat thing about that golden rule. We talk about ecumenism. Every major faith on the planet has that line in their sacred texts. So it's not unique to Christianity, whatever. But you know, it's just a good rule of thumb. So all of our 20,000 coworkers know that that's the golden rule applied to business. We don't specifically come out and say, hey, this is, because when Don Zietlow actually hired me at Kwik Trip, one of his lines was, John, I want you to preach the gospel like you've always been doing. You're just going to take out the word Jesus. For those of you who've heard me talk in many contexts, Mike could be the first to say, he's heard these stories before in the context of a homily. Oh, and I just do it in corporate America. I just take out the word Jesus. But here's the interesting piece, is even though you don't mention it explicitly, the truth of it just resonates with people. The truth just resonates. They're like, wow, that's good stuff. Wow, if we led our company like that. We don't have to say it because the truth in of itself speaks for itself. You don't always have to articulate that that's where it comes from, but they recognize it deep down. The second piece that we're actually somewhat nuanced about, and actually there was a comment in the Tribune Sunday because of it. As many of you know, I used to be in ordained ministry for the Catholic Church. I was a Catholic priest for 11 years, and then left for a whole host of reasons. Got my dispensation from the Vatican and was then married. We don't publicize that in my biography when they announce who I am. In my biography, they'll say John was an instructor and principal at Aquinas High School. They don't say that he was a Catholic priest. Because if in my intro you say that, automatically just 50% of the people like, I ain't going this route, you know, or this is this guy about. So we don't publicize it. But it's amazing how many people after the keynote will come up and say, do you have a religious background? Do you have a theology background? Because boy, what you said really sounds a lot like I was trained by either the Jesuits or my Lutheran background. It's just like, yeah, I was. And then I come clean, you know. And so you can preach the message in a way that doesn't antagonize people. Because if you do it, again, it's also intentional, my approach. I tell stories. You know, there was a lot of bullet points. Because when you tell stories, and I can look around and I see some of you get teary-eyed as I tell the story because you plugged into it. You go, I've had that experience. You can't negate the truth of that experience in your heart. And you can't argue with that. And you can't say, well, geez, why did you say that? Is that when we speak our common language as human beings, that all of our stories are universal. And all of our stories are part of a bigger story. When you just articulated a story, people recognize the truth of it, and they don't become antagonistic. I can count on one hand in the last 25 years of doing public speaking in which someone took argument with something I said. Because let's just speak about compassion, about caring for each other, about spending some time in contemplation, whatever that tradition is for you. And when you speak that, I don't think we can argue against it. That's how we do it internally at Kwik Trip. The training that I do at Kwik Trip is exactly what you saw here. You saw one of my training sessions. This is exactly how I do it. And the people at coworkers say, well, you come to one of the training sessions with John, make sure you bring Kleenex because he's going to tell a couple of stories. But you just tell the story and say, let's just talk about all of us as compassionate, good people. It's part of all of our traditions, not just Christianity, not just Islam. It's part of all of our traditions. And when you talk about that commonality of us as human beings, it unites us. Does that answer the question? Yep. So that's how we do it. Yeah, Don Zietlow, who's our owner and CEO, that's why I'm very grateful. And most people who leave ministry really flounder to find their next career. I was really grateful that the weekend that I resigned from ministry, Father Bob Cook, who's a good friend of mine, and Don Zietlow are good friends, and Bob says, hey, Don, you got to talk to this guy, because Kwik Trip in 2004 was just about to start our culture revolution, where we really worked on customer service. Don had heard someone speak from Southwest Airlines, Ann Rhodes, who talks about good corporate culture. And Don came back from that conference and said, I want to make Kwik Trip for the convenience store industry what Southwest Airlines is for the airline industry. And it was fortuitous, grace, whatever you want to call it, is that the weekend I resigned, they were starting to interview for someone that would do this kind of work at Kwik Trip. And so I went down to meet with Don, and Don said, yeah, I never heard you speak, but I heard about you. They're very strong Christians, the Zietlow family, very strong. He said, I want this company run from a gospel perspective, but we don't explicitly say that. Would you be willing to come help us do that? And I said, well, Don, I'm actually on a 1-year leave of absence from ministry, and after that I've decided whether or not I'm going to go back to ministry or do something else. Well, I was there for all of 3 months and said, I'm not leaving. And because what I found in that organization is that the higher up you went in the company, the nicer the people got. And I never worked for corporate America before, so I'm like, hey, where's the creeps and where's the backstabbers and whatever kind of thing, where's the politics? And frankly, the politics there was less than I ever dealt with in the church. I'm just, and I'm like, and I remember thinking, this is too good, and I kept waiting to meet, when is the shoe going to fall? And I've been there now 14 years. I'll retire from there. Because you have a family that owns us that says this is our values. And we're real lucky that we now have the grandkids coming into the company. And my role is to work and mentor with the grandkids to make sure that they keep the same perspective as, they say, Gramps. That faith perspective. So it can't happen in every company. It does in ours. And I think all 20,000 of us are very grateful that it is. Yep, he's good. And not only that, but also impacts the vendors that we choose. You saw a beautiful story a couple weeks ago, about La Crosse Sign. This is not an accidental connection, kind of thing, is that the vendors we choose also have our values. Because what we found is that if your personal values match your corporate values, you find happiness. It's actually one of the biggest sources of struggle in corporate America is when people's personal values don't match the company values. Some of you may have known that in your lives. But if you find a place where your values match how the company values, you find happiness and you never leave. Yeah, sure. Some of you may have heard me tell this story. Mercury Marine invited me to do a 2-hour presentation on having a sense of purpose at work. And as I'm doing this 2-hour presentation, there's this guy in the back of the room, their lead engineer, big tough guy, balding. Looked like the kind of guy that if this was closing time at the bar scene, you wouldn't mess with this guy because he'd mess with you. And I could tell by the look on this guy's face that he's not buying what I'm selling, So at the end, we did this. Any questions? And he shoots his hand up, and he points to the slides, and he says, that is a load of fill in the blank. He said, there's no purpose in what I do. We're talking about purpose at work. I design and build boat motors. What's the purpose in that? It's a manufacturing job. I just make widgets. I said, sir, can I have 5 minutes? As I mentioned, the first couple years of my life, we lived in South Milwaukee. My dad was a construction worker, never graduated high school, made Jeff Foxworthy look like a culture genius, okay? Use the F word as noun, adjective, adverb, comma, preposition, kind of thing. Smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. I had an Irish temper, and so if things weren't going well at work that day, we knew about it when Dad got home. But my dad's attitude and disposition changed completely at the beginning of every summer on Memorial Day weekend, and this is how it happened. Dad would get home at 5 o'clock, Friday Memorial Day weekend, and he'd back our 1973 Dodge Charger up to our boat that had a Mercury Marine outboard on the back. And we would drive 5 hours north to northern Wisconsin, north of Mercer, a place called Pine Lake. We'd get there about 11:30. Dad would put the boat in the water. He'd put me in the boat with him as 4 years old. We'd go out to the middle of the lake, and Dad would turn the boat motor off, and he'd put my life jacket on nice and tight, and he'd put me in his arms. And he'd go, and a 1, and a 2, and he'd throw me in the lake, and we'd go swimming for the next half hour till about midnight, and then we'd go back to the cottage, and for the next 2.5 days, my dad's attitude and disposition completely changed. He was fun to be with. He was relaxed, like my ideal older brother, not just a dad. And then on Monday, Memorial Day at noon, we'd put the boat back in the trailer, and we'd drive 5 hours south back to Milwaukee. And those of you know that area, you go on Highway 41 through Fond du Lac, past the Mercury Marine plant. And I was 4 years old at the time, in the back seat of the car, and my dad would say to me, "Johnny, look out the big window. You see that big building? That's the home of the boat motor." And I remember being a 4-year-old boy in the back seat of the car looking at that building, being so grateful that it existed, because it built something that changed my dad. And I said, "Sir, I don't know if you were working here at Mercury Marine at the time, but if you were, I want to thank you for building something that changed my dad. That some of the best memories I have of my dad have now gone 10 years because of that boat. Thank you for building that." Big, tough engineer, there's tears streaming down his cheeks. And he walked out that day and he said, "Hey, thanks for teaching me that my job has a purpose. I realize that I don't simply build boat motors. I realize I bring joy to people's lives. And there's a difference." I'm a firm believer that no matter how hard the business is or what it is, that there's purpose in what we do. Jim Collins, who's a business expert, built Alaska Good to Great, some of you read those books, says if you want a place where people are engaged at work, help them know that the job that they do makes a difference, that there's a purpose, and that we might gain the deepest of all satisfactions. His exact quote, "Knowing that our short time here on this earth has been well spent and that it mattered." And so I think regardless of the job, it's help our people to recall that what they do, it matters. It's more than just making a buck. That doesn't drive business. We know companies where the goal is just the bottom line, the dollar. Those companies don't last. If you want a company that lasts, they plug into that purpose. That was the toughest audience I had, and that's how I tried to win them over.
Oh, very good. Thank you again, John, for this afternoon. We do not have a community conversation in December. We'll be back in January at English Lutheran on the third Wednesday. And Jeff Thompson, the retired CEO of Gunderson Lutheran, what is it now? Gunderson Medical Center? Is that what it is now? But in any case, he'll be our speaker. Pastors are going to meet downstairs in the youth room for Interfaith Leaders Coalition. And thank you all for coming. Have a good week.